When the Germans came, they didn't just take homes. They took heat. They took soap. They took the handles off doors and the hinges off beds. In occupied Europe, confiscation wasn't random. It was systematic. Radios, pots, furniture, tools gone. What was left behind wasn't enough to live with. But somehow, families lived anyway. We like to believe survival came from weapons or ration cards. But real survival began when there was nothing left to trade. When entire apartments were stripped bare and people still had to cook, stay warm, and protect their children. It wasn't just resistance fighters who adapted. They were widows, farmers, school children. People who had never fought a day in their life were forced to rebuild their daily world using scraps, soot, and instinct. You'll see how chairs became locks, how broken glass kept bread safe, and how a missing hammer didn't stop them from making shelter. Because survival didn't come from strength. It came from remembering how to make something from nothing. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the lost knowledge that held families together when the world was being torn apart. Number 1, salt harvest from seawater. When even the salt vanished, survival had to be boiled back out of the earth. Salt wasn't a seasoning in wartime, it was a tool. It preserved food, healed wounds, and kept hunger at bay. But under German occupation, salt became one of the first things to disappear. Confiscated from markets, rationed in crumbs, traded for silence. Without it, meat rotted faster. Bread went stale overnight. Even boiling water felt less clean. But for families near the coast, nature still whispered an answer. They turned to the sea. Buckets were lowered into tide pools, tin pails filled with brackish water. Children carried it home sloshing in kettles and broken ceramic pots. What looked like nothing, just cloudy seawater, was treated like treasure. In hidden corners of ruined courtyards, flat pans were placed under the sun. Some boiled it on clay stoves fueled with scrap wood. As the water vanished into steam, tiny crystals clung to the metal like frost. It wasn't quick, it wasn't clean, but it was salt, pure enough to coat vegetables, strong enough to rub into raw fish, essential enough to barter for bread. Those who lacked metal trays poured water over cloth, stretched tight on wooden frames. They waited days for the sun to finish what fire couldn't. At the end, the cloth was scraped, folded, tapped, and grainy white flakes fell free. Salt for the table, salt for the wound, salt for staying alive another week. Nothing was wasted. Even the leftover brine was poured back to begin again. And no one spoke of it, because if the wrong eyes saw what they were making, even the sea would be taken from them. These weren't grand operations. They were gestures of defiance etched into sand and smoke. And when the last grain was gathered and the fire turned cold, they faced the next problem: how to keep insects out of everything that salt couldn't save. That's when families turned to smoke, not for warmth, but as a living wall against rot. Number 2, hide food inside animal carcasses. When cupboards were emptied, cellars stripped, and walls torn apart, families began hiding food where no one dared to look. In many occupied towns, the German searches weren't casual, they were ruthless. Soldiers knew every hiding spot. Under floorboards, behind bricks, inside chimneys, they flipped mattresses, stabbed grain sacks, and even opened baked loaves looking for contraband. So families had to think differently, not where food could be hidden, but where it wouldn't be touched. And that's where livestock came in. Animals that died from age, sickness, or cold weren't discarded. Their carcasses, once burned or buried, became unlikely vaults. The logic was brutal, but effective. Soldiers might steal meat, but they rarely inspected what was already decaying. The smell alone turned them away. Families began hollowing out sections of rib cages, removing organs and wrapping dry goods flour, dry beans, salt, even bits of lard into cloth or waxed paper. These were tucked inside the belly cavity, then stitched or covered with straw and hung in sheds as if left to rot. Some used cow hides stuffed with food and folded shut like sacks. Others used the hollow bones of pigs or goats, filling them with dried herbs or coffee substitutes. In colder regions where decay was slower, even larger animals were used as open decoys, while real food was buried just beneath them in crates sealed with wax. It wasn't pleasant. It was unspeakable. But it worked. Children were told not to speak of it, not because of shame, but because one wrong word could bring armed men to the barn. And then the cost would be far more than just food. No one wrote these tricks down. They were passed in whispers, shared between neighbors at night, taught through demonstration rather than language. And when the meat spoiled beyond disguise, they burned it themselves, ensuring no trace of the secret was left behind. Even survival had to be hidden. Even hunger had to be masked. But the next challenge was keeping what little they had safe from pests, rats, beetles, and mold. And for that, they turned to fire, not for heat or light, but for smoke that kept decay at the door. Number 3, floors to hide compartments. Sometimes the safest place to hide something was the floor beneath your feet. When the Germans confiscated entire rooms in minutes, families realized that anything in plain sight could be taken, or worse, used against them. Bread ovens became checkpoints. Beds turned into search zones. But there was one place still under their control. Literally. Old wooden floors, especially in rural homes, weren't sealed with concrete or nails. They were planks, loose, uneven, sometimes already broken. That imperfection became their shield. In kitchens, narrow boards were quietly pried up using knives or broken tools. Beneath them lay shallow earth or brick foundation, just enough space to bury jars, cloth sacks, or tin boxes. Some families hollowed out small pits and lined them with ash or stone to keep moisture away. Others simply wrapped food in oilcloth and left it directly in the dirt. The trick wasn't just hiding it, it was making the floor look untouched. Boards were nailed back down with mismatched heads or weighed with furniture. In some homes, even the creak of the wood was memorized, so nothing sounded out of place. To fool any inspection, they spread flour or dirt over the seams, brushing it smooth. Some even used melted wax to fill in gaps and mask the edges of boards. Children were trained not to look down at certain spots. Guests were never allowed to help clean. The illusion had to be total. In colder areas, compartments were dug deeper, lined with straw or wool to trap warmth, making these makeshift hiding spots double as root cellars. Some were even large enough to hold a child for a few minutes if danger knocked too loud. These floors didn't just hide food, they held letters, radios, memories. Because survival wasn't only about hunger, it was about keeping what mattered most out of enemy hands. But even the best hidden stash couldn't last forever. Not without protection from rot and rodents. So families turned to one of the oldest allies they had, firewood smoke. Not for warmth, not for cooking, but to drive pests back into the shadows and keep what little was hidden safe a little longer. Number 4, repurposed medicine bottles for hidden storage. They were too small to feed a family, too fragile to defend a home, but these tiny glass bottles became lifelines when nothing else was left. When occupation turned every drawer and cabinet into a risk, families learned to shrink their survival. They couldn't hide bags. They couldn't stash crates. But a medicine bottle? That was invisible. Old pill vials, cough syrup jars, even eye drop containers, once discarded or forgotten, were cleaned, dried, and reassigned. What they held next wasn't medicine, but memory. A pinch of salt, a spoon of sugar, crushed herbs, ground coffee, seeds for planting when peace returned, gold shavings or thread from a torn wedding dress. These were sealed tight and hidden in plain sight on shelves, in pockets, under beds. Some went further. Mothers stitched tiny loops into skirts where the bottle could hang beneath the hem. Others unscrewed chair legs and dropped one inside just enough space to store a dose of hope. A glass bottle could be disguised with soot or oil to look like it hadn't been touched in years. Labels were smeared, lids mismatched. Some even filled the top half with old syrup, and the bottom with something entirely different, 2 lives in 1 bottle. Children were taught how to handle them with care, not because they'd break, but because they carried too much to lose. These weren't treasures meant to be used often. They were rationed in drops, measured, counted, protected, and when the risk of a raid rose too high, the bottles were buried in garden corners or tucked into walls behind broken bricks. Even medical visitors didn't question them. A bottle with a foreign label, a dark liquid, a cork sealed with wax, it all looked exactly like it should. That was the genius. It wasn't camouflage through hiding, it was camouflage through familiarity. And while one bottle couldn't change the course of war, it could change a night. A spoon of tea on a freezing day. A grain of sugar for a sick child, a sprig of dried mint to make dirty water taste almost clean. But like all small miracles, even this trick relied on one thing, keeping pests and moisture out. And to do that, families reached for smoke, once again, not as fuel, but as a shield. A haze in the rafters, a scent in the walls, enough to keep hunger at bay. One more night. Number 5, reclaimed soap from grease renders. Soap vanished early. It was rationed, then removed. Factories were converted for war. Markets carried nothing but rumor. But the dirt didn't pause. Infection didn't wait. Mothers still needed to scrub their hands. Farmers still needed to clean tools. And after burying the dead, hands had to be washed. So they made their own. Not in vats or tubs, but in small pots, over weak fires, with grease that barely smelled like food anymore. The fat came from scraps dripping, saved after cooking. Hardened globs scraped from pans, yellowed slabs dug from behind cellars. It didn't matter what animal it came from. If it burned, it worked. They melted it slowly, stir it with sticks, added handfuls of wood ash sifted from stoves and fire pits. The mixture hissed, bubbled, changed. And what emerged wasn't soap in any modern sense. It was rough. It crumbled. It smelled like burned skin and wet stone. But it was cleaned. Rough hands were rubbed raw, but wounds closed faster. Dishes didn't fester. Babies didn't get sick as often. Each batch was different. Some crumbled too quickly, others were too caustic to use on skin. But every bar was a small victory, a reclaiming of something the world had tried to erase. Sometimes they added crushed mint or dried lavender, if it could be found, to mask the smell. Others just buried the bars under cloth, pulling them out only when absolutely needed. No one called it luxury. They didn't even call it soap. But it worked. And it stayed hidden. Because even a bar of rough, cracked soap could be taken. So they wrapped them in rags, labeled them as lard or animal waste, and stored them near coal to hide the scent. Even the act of washing became silent. Done quickly, behind doors, without splash or sound. Because cleanliness wasn't about pride anymore, it was about staying alive. And as long as they had fire, fat, and ash, they could keep one more illness away. One more infection out, one more child breathing through winter. But the next fight wasn't against filth. It was cold against drafty walls and broken windows. And for that, they turned to the scraps of cloth and forgotten glass to trap warmth inside homes that had already been stripped bare. Number 6. False bottom in milk pails. Milk pails were everywhere on farms, in village kitchens, carried down dirt roads each morning. They looked ordinary, innocent, but in some homes, they became moving vaults. The trick was simple, but the execution had to be perfect. A false bottom just a few centimeters thick was built inside the base of the pail using tin, wood, or thick waxed cloth. On top, the day's milk. Beneath it, silence, rolled ration papers, dry tobacco, matchsticks, salt, or crushed herbs. Everything had to be sealed airtight. One leak, one drip, and it was over. The milk couldn't spoil. The container couldn't rattle. The surface couldn't betray the secret it floated above. Mothers often handled the pails themselves, claiming the weight was too heavy for children. They walked calmly past checkpoints, through village squares, sometimes right under the noses of men with guns. Even when questioned, they lifted the lid, tilted the pail slightly just enough to show the cream on top, never the bottom. A woman with milk was seen as harmless, just another peasant trying to survive. But she might be delivering medicine to a neighbor. She might be carrying a stolen map, or a day's worth of flour pressed flat in a wax pouch. Some pails even had double lids, one false rim of milk on top of a tin plate with completely dry space beneath. Ingenious, risky, effective. Children were taught never to spill, not just because of waste, but because secrets swam inside. At night, the pails were washed with silence. The compartments were cleaned, dried, resealed. No one ever left them unattended. Even animals were kept away. One startled goat could ruin a week's planning. Because this wasn't just milk. It was a movement. It was survival disguised as routine. And even if nothing was hidden inside, the habit remained because the moment they let their guard down, the illusion would shatter. But while this trick carried secrets across towns, families still faced one brutal truth. They could carry salt and flour, but not warmth. So they began stitching warmth back into their homes, using rags, glass shards, and anything left that could trap heat behind broken walls. Number 7. Using animal furs or skins as insulation. When windows shattered and chimneys froze, survival meant stitching warmth from what once breathed. After the Germans confiscated bedding, wool, and coats, families across Eastern Europe faced winter with nothing but walls that leaked wind. Blankets were gone. Firewood was rare. And in some homes, even the doors had been taken, burned, traded, or stolen for scrap. But every village still had animals. Even when livestock was scarce, some skins remained. Hides from old goats, thin rabbits, or chickens left for dead. These weren't pelts for luxury, they were remnants of survival. And with needle and thread, they were reborn. Women softened stiff skins over fire embers, rubbing in ash or lard until they could be bent without cracking. Then they stitched them together not for beauty, but to trap breath, hung on windows, nailed across doors, draped over beds where children slept in corners, mouths tucked beneath the fur. In many homes, the floors were covered first. Cold crept up from beneath, so families laid furs, hide side down, skin side up layers that stopped frost from climbing into bones. Sometimes, straw or hay was packed beneath to cushion the step. Other times, nothing but stone below and skin above. Old coats were unstitched and remade as quilts. Some families made fur sleeves that could be slid over arms and legs at night, primitive but effective. Even shoes were stuffed with strips of hide to stop frostbite when firewood ran out. And when night came, they didn't spread out to sleep. They huddled close, 3 or 4 bodies wrapped in one large hide, breathing warmth back into the space between them. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't clean, but it kept them breathing when the snow piled up against doors. Because when the world outside froze solid, survival meant wrapping yourself in whatever was left of the living. And those walls of stitched fur couldn't stop every cold wind, but they could hold back the worst of it. But even in warmth, hunger never stopped. So families turned next to what grew wild and what could be hidden in plain sight. Seeds, herbs, and roots that no soldier thought to steal. Number 8, smoke-infused grain storage. When grain meant life, the fight wasn't just to grow it, but to keep it from disappearing in the dark. Food didn't vanish only through confiscation. Rats, weevils, and mold were constant enemies. In places where even a handful of oats could mean another day alive, families couldn't afford to lose what little they had. But with no access to pesticides, airtight containers, or refrigeration protection had to come from something more primal. They turned to smoke, not just any smoke. It had to be dense, dry, and constant, the kind that came from slow-burning hardwood packed tight and left to smolder. In barns and cellars, smoke was guided through narrow chimneys or simple vent holes. Sacks of grain tied with rags or wrapped in cloth were stacked in the path of that bitter haze. The goal wasn't to cook it, it was to coat it. Grain soaked in that smoke didn't rot as quickly. Insects stayed away. Even moisture seemed slower to cling. The scent lingered earthy, sharp, but it meant preservation. Families grew used to the taste. Some even preferred it, because smoked grain meant survival had outwitted the rats. Storage pits beneath homes were lined with charcoal or ash. Some placed hot coals in one corner, blowing gently to spread the smoke without fire. Others built hanging racks inside sheds, letting grain dry slowly in burlap sacks. The method was passed quietly. A neighbor might teach another by gesture alone. No words spoken, no instructions written. Because if soldiers discovered the technique, even smoke might be outlawed. Children helped fan the embers, careful not to let sparks catch. Elders sniffed the grain, checking for spoil. It was a dance of instinct, primitive but exact. And though the grain tasted like smoke, it fed the weak. It is baked into bread. It thickened soups. It gave strength where none should remain. But even protected food couldn't help if the tools to cook were gone. So families turned next to rebuilding what had been taken apart. Stone ovens, ash stoves, and fire pits built from broken walls and shattered chimneys. Because even if the ingredients survived, the fire had to live too. Number 9, eggshell calcium extraction for building materials. In broken towns where cement was gone and lime was rationed, families began saving something no one would suspect: eggshells. They weren't hoarding for food. The shells were crushed, dried, and stored like gold dust. Not because they could eat them, but because those fragile white fragments held what the war had stolen: calcium. The plaster had disappeared, bricks crumbled, mortar supplies were seized or redirected to military construction. But repairs still had to be made, walls patched, ovens resealed, tools reforged. And so, eggshells became construction material. It started with drying. Shells were collected from every kitchen, scraped clean of yolk, and left under the sun. Once brittle, they were ground between stones under boots, sometimes pounded with the handle of a spoon. What remained was a fine white powder, sharp and dry. Mixed with ash and a few drops of water, it formed a paste. Add wood soot, and it strengthens into a kind of primitive lime. Not strong enough for full walls, but enough to fill a crack, bind loose bricks, or line a fire pit. In some towns, older builders remembered using similar methods during the First World War. They taught it again quietly, passing down what the textbooks had never written. Because now, every shell saved meant a roof didn't leak, a stove didn't fall apart, a wind didn't creep in through the wall. The technique varied. Some used eggshell powder as a coating over clay bricks. Others combined it with animal hair and straw to hold it firm. Children mixed the powders. The elders applied the paste. And no one ever threw a shell away again. It was more than resourceful. It was resistance through rebuilding. Each patched hole was a refusal. Each sealed oven was a step toward permanence. Each egg cracked in silence fed 2 mouths, one with food and one with the power to keep shelter standing. Because survival wasn't just about eating, it was about keeping the walls upright long enough to make it to the next season. But what came next wasn't about shelter, it was about stealth. The same hands that mended walls now found ways to hide tools and letters inside them. Not to survive the weather, but to survive being seen. They didn't survive with strength. They survived with memory. Every false wall, every crushed leaf, every stitched hide wasn't just a tactic, it was a testimony. Of mothers who turned cooking grease into soap, of fathers who hollowed out floorboards while pretending to sweep, of children who learned to stay quiet not out of fear, but out of duty. These weren't grand inventions. They were small decisions made daily in silence. 1,000 forgotten hands holding the line, not with rifles, but with rope, ash, and instinct. And somehow, that was enough. Because survival didn't come from what they owned. It came from what they remembered, what they passed down, what they refused to let die, even when everything else was taken. Now, as we walk freely through homes filled with light, comfort, and choice, we owe it to them to remember. Not out of pity, not out of nostalgia, but because their methods still matter, their defiance still speaks, and their wisdom, buried under dust and time, still holds answers for a world that forgets too fast. If you felt that too, if you felt the quiet strength in every scene, then bring this knowledge back. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Because every time you do, you're helping restore the survival skills that history tried to erase. And they deserve to be remembered.